All right. Tonight, we are looking at the work of three largely forgotten men whose art beautifully tracks the changing ideas of the American frontier. They worked over the back half of the 1800s, about as transformative half-century as you could find in the United States. And as always, art comments on the society that it's made in, and with these particular works, it actually had the power to change it. So we've got three vignettes tonight, starting with part one, a panoramic view. All right. Thank you. It is 1842. Close your eyes, if you will, for me, just for a moment, and picture the American West, the frontier. How many of you pictured the Mississippi River? Probably not a lot, but in the 1840s, this was the edge of the map. This was where the frontier was. This was where a country ready to continue its glorious conquest of the West and manifest destiny is springing from. It's where we have pioneers, and it's where we meet. Very good. John Banford. By 1842, Banford had been on his own for 11 years. He's 27 years old, and he's had a lot of jobs. He was a failed pharmacist assistant. He was an entertainer on a Mississippi River boat. He had his own theatrical production company for about 2 seasons, and now he finds himself as the scene painter for a local theater company in Kentucky, and he has an idea for a panoramic painting. This style of panoramic painting has been around for, since about the 1700s, where you put it on rollers and the scene can move by, but no one has conceived of a painting the scale that John Banford is conceiving. So, maps. So he sells everything he owns. He gets himself a boat, he gets himself some art supplies, he gets himself some goods that are good for trading and barter, and he sets out on the Mississippi River, going from St. Louis to New Orleans. This is a trip that will take him 2 years. He sketches everything he sees, and he documents all the encounters that he has with the peoples and the places that he goes. He returns to Kentucky, and he starts painting in a barn. He paints for another 2 years. When he's not painting, he's coming up with technical solutions like, how do I get a canvas that's 12 feet tall and infinite long? How do I make rollers that will support the weight of this great infinite length canvas? And he comes up with all those solutions, and he ultimately creates a work that is just over 1/4 of a mile long. It's easily the longest painting that's ever been made. And it's not a painting that's meant to be seen. It is a painting that is meant to be experienced as part of a traveling show. This show is immediately successful, where Banford tells the stories of his travels on the river, only slightly exaggerated. There's maybe a few more brigands and pirates than there actually were, but it's also a fun account of the American West at the time. And as I said, the show is immediately successful. I progressed a little too fast, it's fine. Traveling from Kentucky to Boston to New York to London. Queen Victoria gets a private showing of it, and she loves it. Everybody loves it. Dickens loves it. Longfellow loves it. And as the audiences increase and as the spectacle increases, so does the performance. And he didn't just predict kind of cinema, but he predicted 4D cinema. When the weather changed, the wind would blow. Wind! Wind! Yes! And the lights for the lightning would crackle. And when it rained, the water would splash. With success like this, it was obvious that imitators and plagiarists were going to come along. All over the United States and Europe, there started popping up panorama shows. And wouldn't you know it, a lot of them happened to be set on the Mississippi River. But the one thing that they could not copy was John Banford, the undisputed master of the form. In just 8 years, Banford has become the most famous, critically acclaimed, commercially adored artist in the world. By charging about 50 cents a head a show, he is very likely the first millionaire artist in history. And yet today, almost none of his art survives. I've actually had to do a little bit of plagiarism of my own. The canvas we've been looking at is actually one of the very few remaining massive Mississippi mural paintings in existence, but not by Bamford, but instead by an artist named John Egan. This is basically the only painting by Bamford that I was able to find that's positively attributed to him that we could show tonight. Anyway, well, art and ships. Anyway, we'll come back to Bamford a little bit later, but for now, we'll close on this section with Bamford returning to the United States, having made millions selling the idea of the West as a land of infinite possibility and adventure. He himself is an example of what that abundance has to offer, where someone can start with nothing and become the most famous, richest artist in the world. Moving forward just a couple of years and moving westward, we get to Carleton Watkins. So, it is 1861, and this is the United States of America. The Civil War has just broken out along the east and in the south, and California, one of the newest states, is sided with the Union. They provide troops, they provide supplies, but the war itself is pretty far away. Having traveled the breadth of the United States and making his home on the edge of that frontier, San Francisco-based photographer Carleton Watkins is about to make the most consequential trip of his career. And before we move on, this is just a really fun fact. Yes, that is the Golden Gate prior to there being a Golden Gate Bridge. So, Watkins. He is probably the most technically advanced landscape photographer working in his time, traveling by mule with close to a ton of equipment, including a custom-built camera that he commissioned from a local cabinet maker. He travels someplace that very few Westerners have ever seen and almost no one has photographed. Working with 18 by 22 inch glass plates that need to be exposed while wet, and with a traveling darkroom tint, he captures some of the very first images of the Yosemite Valley. Almost more impressive to me are his photographs of the giant sequoias in the Mariposa Grove. Capturing big living things is so challenging, and he does it beautifully. I don't know if any of you noticed what he put in for scale, but those are people standing at the base of that tree. So, his photographs from his gallery in San Francisco travel slowly across the United States and ultimately become supplementary materials in a land report headed to the US Congress and finally to this man in particular. These images are so influential in that report that Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove become the first protected lands in the United States, ostensibly starting the National Parks Program in 1864 with the Yosemite Valley Grant Act. Now, a few of you might be asking the question, wait a second, Lincoln, not Roosevelt? Wait, 1864? The Civil War is still going on. What is Lincoln doing signing this into law during the middle of the Civil War? Well, you would not be alone with that thought, and that is a future talk alert at some point. We do not have time for it, but the origin of the Parks program has its start in radically progressive abolition and reconstruction policy. So come back to a future Salon and we'll find out about that. What we do have time for is a few more of these pictures. Of the people we're talking about who are forgotten tonight, Watkins to me is the most tragic, just beautiful images. Art. All right. We're moving just a couple more years into the future. This is the United States in 1886. And yes, and I think there's this idea of like Western expansion is this straight line that moved across the United States, but really the US conquered the coasts and then worked to fill in the middle. And yes, a few little pieces of the country have been protected for conservation. And, you know, that's out in California. What does that have to do with the buffalo? That's the question that the National Museum, what will become the Smithsonian, and its chief taxidermist, William Temple Hornaday, have to ask. After years of ineffective outcry, it is very likely that the buffalo is going to become extinct. A species that once numbered in the tens of millions is down to maybe 500 individuals left in the wild. Expecting the worst, Hornaday sets out, like so many other white hunters, to shoot him a couple buffalo. His goal is to preserve them for the museum's taxidermy department and create a lasting record for this once great, soon-to-be extinct mammal. We know all of this for a fact because Hornaday wrote it down in a letter to his successor. In 1957, the Smithsonian's buffalo exhibit had seen some better days and was being dismantled. In its foundations, they found this letter from Hornaday explaining his hunt and his hope that this would provide a resource to future generations who would not have the chance to see the buffalo. The attached editorial from the Cosmopolitan is pretty fiery and pretty fun read if you get a chance. But in 1957, as today, we know that the buffalo is not extinct. So it's good news. And so the letter itself comes off is a little endearing and a little bit sad in its defeatism. But if that taxidermist knew anything about his predecessor, it probably came off a little bit funny as well, because the buffalo did not go extinct thanks largely to the conservation efforts of one William Temple Hornaday. After that last hunt, he was obsessed with protecting the buffalo, went out and found live specimens wherever he could, got them into the burgeoning zoo programs across the country, worked with private ranchers on breeding programs, and even under President Teddy Roosevelt, was able to start releasing herds back into the wild. I put this picture up to soften the blow because William Temple Hornaday deserves all the lauding. He did a very, very good thing, but he was also a white man in the 1800s, which, you're right, he was probably a huge racist. Did he display a Congolese man in the zoo in the Bronx Zoo next to orangutans? He did. And even that really great thing about those herds going back into the wild, they went back into the wild in land stolen from the Apache, the Comanche, and the Koa. As a couple of fun postscripts to this, though, the Sishangu and Lakota nations are some of the people currently really working to conserve and protect the buffalo, especially with the creation of the Woolakota Buffalo Range, which is a 28,000-acre preserve of natural grasslands. And softened by that letter, those taxidermists at the Smithsonian did not, in fact, dissemble the buffalo, but instead restored them and returned them to their native Montana, where they are still on display today. And so I'd like to wrap up by going back to John Banvard for just a second, because I think the back half of his story is equally a story of the West. It took him 4 years to make his masterpiece, 6 years to become a millionaire, and 30 years to squander it. He built himself a giant McMansion in Long Island. He tried to start his own museum. He got into a PR war with P.T. Barnum, never recommended. He plagiarized a play and a book, and ultimately he left back to go back into the West, into the frontier, this time not for adventure, but to live in his son's spare room. But I like to leave things on a positive note because that creative spark was still with him. And while living in the Dakotas, he decided he was going to create one last great panorama, the burning of Columbia, a Civil War painting, and tried to tour with it. But his health being what it was in his old age, and the population of the Dakotas being what it was and is, the tour did not last long. But a local historian keeps this last very positive review. Painted canvases, ropes, windlasses, kerosene drums, screens, shutters, a revolving drum were his accessories. Marching battalions, dashing cavalry, roaming cannons, blazing buildings, the rattle of the musketry, and the din of battle were the products. The resulting in final spectacle was beyond belief. Which brings us to today. It's 2024, and this is the United States. The lasting legacy of these stories is still baked into the American West. We are sitting in the middle of a boom and bust gold rush town, surrounded by brigands and pirates and communities of care. We all have the ability to capture the mundane moments and make them look wonderful, and to travel far and bring back tales of where we've been. But most of all, we live in a time when nihilism is easy, but activism and conservation is still possible. So with that slightly optimistic note, I'd like to raise our glass to the beneficiaries of one of tonight's talks. the Golden Gate Park buffalo. Who, as improbably as all of us, are still out here roaming the West.